Today I'm sharing how I shoot cinematic video with my iPhone. First of all, what do we mean by cinematic exactly? Well, for me, cinematic footage is the type of footage that shares the same technical and artistic qualities as films. So in order to create cinematic footage, all we have to do is imitate what they do in films. Yeah, pretty much. That's easier said than done though, right? No, not really. So using films as our guide, I've come up with a cinematic footage checklist that we're going to be working our way through today. The first thing on the list is a 24 frames per second frame rate. The next thing is using the right settings and having control over them. There's camera movement and composition, and finally, the thing that makes any footage look instantly cinematic, a widescreen aspect ratio. And each one of the things on this list alone isn't enough. All four working together will produce the best results with practice. And it would be great to add a spectacular location to the cinematic footage checklist, but unfortunately, I'm stuck in here. But that's okay, because cinematic footage does not require a spectacular location. It does, however, require shooting and editing apps. For shooting, the most well-known is probably Filmic Pro. I personally use Beastcam, but I recommend the Moment app as well, and I also have full reviews on Procam 8 and ProCamera, so feel free to check those out if you're still unsure about which app is right for you. With editing, if you're using a Mac or a PC, there's this amazing free app you can download called DaVinci Resolve, which I'll leave a link to in the description. But if you're on an iPad or even on the iPhone itself, I highly recommend LumaFusion. Now it is £28.99, but if you're looking to get properly into video, then it is absolutely worth it, and you can use it on multiple devices with a single purchase. But what about iMovie that comes free with all Macs, iPhones and iPads? Well, iMovie is fantastic, it really is. I actually made a living for a few years selling wedding videos that I edited in iMovie, but it's missing a couple of little features that I'll go into properly in the editing portion of this video. So today I'm capturing B-roll for my review of the M1 MacBook Pro, and I'm going to be using my iPhone XR, which is patiently waiting in the background, and I'm going to be using Beastcam. So where do we start? Well, just like with stills photography, I like to keep in mind the reason that I'm shooting and the purpose of the footage. And then I use that information to guide literally everything else that I do. My camera movement, composition, settings, focus, everything. So my video is a laptop review from a YouTuber's perspective. So I want to introduce the laptop and convey information about me to the audience at the same time. So for my first shot, I'm gonna pan around the studio a little bit. You can see the equipment, you can see the size of the studio, etc. And then I'm gonna finish on the laptop. And in order to do this in a cinematic, immersive way, I'm going to pan slowly, smoothly, and I'm going to do it on the laptop's level. Now, obviously there are like handheld, shaky camera movements in films all the time, but slow, smooth, and steady movements are really important in achieving that cinematic look. Like most of the things on this list, it's association. We associate certain things with films. So we would associate a shot like this from like a vlog or a FaceTime call with someone showing you their setup. But slow, smooth, and purposeful movements like pans and dollies are associated with films. To help me compose my shot, I use this really helpful rule of thirds grid. Now most, if not all, video apps and camera apps in general should have a rule of thirds grid built in. So I'm going to start with my lights on this point on the rule of thirds, and then I'm going to pan across and finish with the laptop on this point on the rule of thirds, and I'm going to use the desk as a leading line. I'm also taking advantage of the fact that Beastcam has these widescreen aspect ratio guides built in. See how the widescreen aspect ratio immediately makes the shot look more cinematic? There's nothing intrinsically cinematic about a widescreen aspect ratio. Again, it's just about association. We associate the widescreen aspect ratio with the cinema. Now, only a few apps have these guides built in, but don't worry, these guides aren't actually doing anything to the footage. They are literally just guides to help me compose the shot. The actual cropping of the footage is done later in our editing app, as I'll show you. And this is one reason why iMovie isn't appropriate for what we're doing here today, because it doesn't give you any way of doing this. So once I've decided what my camera movement and my composition is going to be, I can then move on to my settings. First, I want to talk about frame rates. Now, the magical cinematic frame rate, again, that is associated with the cinema is 24 frames per second. 24 frames per second has been the film industry's standard frame rate for decades. So it looks cinematic, again, because we associate it with the cinema, just like the widescreen aspect ratio. There's a link to a clip from Gemini Man in the description, and that's in 60 frames per second, and it looks weird. Watch it and let me know. So we should just set the frame rate to 24 frames per second. Well, not necessarily. In most situations, yes, 24 frames per second is the frame rate I'm going to set the camera to. This is called the capture rate because the camera is then going to capture 24 frames every second. But there's another kind of frame rate we can take advantage of called the playback rate. This is the frame rate the footage is actually played back at when you watch it. And here, again, we're going to take advantage of LumaFusion and DaVinci Resolve because what they allow you to do is shoot at higher frame rates like 48 or 60 frames per second and then edit and export the footage at the cinematic 24 frames per second. There's a few reasons you might want to do this. One of the main ones is that it allows you to slow your footage down, which is going to help smooth out any little camera shakes. And depending on how you've shot, your footage doesn't even have to look like it's in slow motion. So I always start by setting my capture rate to 24 frames per second, and then if I find my footage too shaky, then I'll switch to 60. I also make sure my resolution is set to 4K. Now you don't have to do this, but 4K does give you a lot of benefits over 1080p, such as obviously a higher resolution and more detailed image, higher bit rates for better image quality, especially in low light, more flexibility while editing, and more flexible stabilization. Now, speaking of stabilization, you're definitely going to want to enable any stabilization functions that you have in your camera app. These are going to be a massive help. Now, I personally always shoot with my phone on a gimbal, and if you are serious about shooting video with your phone, then I would highly recommend investing in one of these. And finally, use whatever you have around you to help. So for this opening shot, I'm using the fact that I'm on a swiveling chair to help me pan around the room. And in another shot later on, I take my phone off the gimbal and I actually slide it along the desk. Let's move on to our exposure and white balance settings. Now, having control over these settings and locking them in place is going to stop your exposure and your white balance from changing as you move through the shot, which is not particularly cinematic or immersive. And determining which settings to use might seem intimidating at first, but it's actually really easy. And we're going to use a really simple rule to get us started called the 180-degree shutter rule. Now, just like 24 frames per second and a widescreen aspect ratio, the 180-degree shutter rule is a film industry standard. And it basically says that in order to achieve realistic and natural looking motion blur, you should set your shutter speed to double whatever your frame rate is. Now, realistic and natural looking motion blur doesn't sound like a big deal, but it can make a massive difference to whether your footage looks cinematic or not. Audiences are really great at spotting things that don't look quite right, so janky or unrealistic motion blur could easily take them out of the moment. So with our frame rate set to 24 frames per second, the 180-degree shutter rule tells us that our ideal shutter speed will be 1/48th of a second or 1/50th. And if you're shooting at 60 frames per second, then you should set your shutter speed to 1/20th. It's that simple. And an added benefit of the 180-degree shutter rule is that it will also help prevent flickering from certain light sources as well. Next, because I've established where my camera will start and finish, I can simply run through my shot and choose my ISO based on what looks good. It's as simple as that. So for me, I always try and keep it as low as possible. Now, if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, following the 180-degree shutter rule can be a bit tricky in bright situations. So if you find this happening, then that is another great reason for you to consider shooting at a higher frame rate and therefore a faster shutter speed. Or you could consider investing in an ND filter. Now, this is a variable ND filter from Neewer. This costs just £16 and you just pop it over your lens and then you can adjust it to cut out as much light as you need. Once I'm happy with my exposure, I'll then set the white balance, again, just to what looks good. But in order to maintain that immersive cinematic feeling, you have to make sure that your white balance is consistent from shot to shot. And finally, last but not least, I'm going to set the focus. In this opening shot, I'm not really thinking too much about the focus. I'm just happy to literally tap where I want the focus to be and trust that it's not going to hunt. But in other situations, having control over your focus is something that can really help your footage look cinematic. If your camera isn't going to move, if your camera's fixed, then you can simply tap on the screen to focus in different places. Filmic Pro has this great automatic focus pulling feature that you can set to various different speeds. But if you're not using Filmic Pro and the autofocus is shifting too fast for you, then you can consider switching to manual focus. If your camera is moving but your subject isn't, then you can run through your shot and lock your focus. So as you move through your shot, only that certain point is in focus, which is exactly what I do here. So in all of these shots, you can see everything that I've talked about today working together. These slow, smooth camera movements, the 24 frames per second frame rate, the widescreen aspect ratio, the exposure and white balance settings being locked, and our bonus tip, focus control. So how do we achieve this widescreen aspect ratio and slow down this high frame rate footage in our editing software? Let's start with LumaFusion on the iPad. So in LumaFusion, when you make a new project, make sure you set the frame rate to 24 frames per second. Next, select frame aspect and come down to the bottom where you'll find your cinema aspect ratios. 236 is roughly what our anamorphic lens would have given us, but there's no right or wrong here, it just depends how much cropping you want. Then we can leave the color space and start a new project. Now, when I bring this first clip into the timeline, you can see it's been cropped to 236. Another method of changing the aspect ratio is to crop manually. So tap the pencil icon, make sure you're in frame and fit, then come to cropping and you can crop the top and the bottom to around 12 to 12.5. This next clip is 60 frames per second, but since our timeline and our project are 24 frames per second, it's playing back at 24 frames per second. This means we've got a load of extra frames to use for smooth slow motion. So I can tap the pencil icon again, come into speed and reverse and bring the speed down to 40%. And helpfully, LumaFusion is telling me with this little line here the maximum I can slow the clip down by and still achieve a smooth 24 frames per second playback. Thank you, LumaFusion. So onto the Mac and DaVinci Resolve, which is a beast compared with LumaFusion on the iPad. And there are a few ways to do what we want, but I'm just going to show you what I think are the easiest. So with your clips selected, come up to the timeline, go down to output blanking and choose a widescreen aspect ratio and our bars appear. Then if you want to make an adjustment to your composition, you can come to the color space and adjust the tilt on each clip separately. With the speed, again, there are a few ways, but I've chosen the one that shows you the percent as I think it's the easiest. So in the edit space, right click your clip and choose change clip speed. Now we can type in the percent that we want. Again, the clip is playing back at 24 frames per second. And that reminds me, make sure your project is also at 24 frames per second. So come to File, Project Settings, and make sure the playback frame rate is 24 frames per second. So there you go. How to set a widescreen aspect ratio and slow down higher frame rate clips in 24 frames per second timelines in LumaFusion and DaVinci Resolve. By the way, the reason that I chose LumaFusion and DaVinci Resolve as the two apps to show you in this video is simply because they're the two that I deemed most appropriate for the audience searching how to get started with cinematic video on their phones, because it's really not fair if we run through all the tips and then I say, okay, beginners, let's now head into our $250 or whatever editing suite so we can add these black bars. Something else that will make your footage look more cinematic, if you do it right, is color grading. Now, I'm not going to go into color grading in this video simply because I want to focus more on the shooting side of things. I want you to get used to that and practice all of the tips that we went through today. I'll be more than happy to show you how I color grade my footage in a follow-up video. But for now, the best thing for you to do would simply be to search YouTube for like cinematic color grading in, or how to color grade footage in, you know, and then whichever software that you're using. Keep in mind that color grading alone, just like with still photographs, won't make poorly shot footage look decent. You have to put the work in when you actually shoot the footage. And that is everything I have for you today. There's plenty of information and ideas there to get you started with cinematic video on your iPhone. And if you want to see the footage that I shot today in action, head over to my review of the M1 MacBook Pro. But in the meantime, thank you so much for watching. Take care and Aussie Buna.